Started. All right, so 1 Samuel chapter 24. If you remember where we left off last time, we have read about David being on the move. By the beginning of chapter 24, he's located in the city of En-Gedi, and we looked at a map. It's right there on the western coast of the Dead Sea. It was known for the wild goats that lived in that area. Hence, back in verse 2 of chapter 24, Saul sends his men to find David upon the rocks of the wild goats. That's just a reference to the region of En-Gedi. And we talked about some reasons why David would have fled to this area. Again, where David has just come from is a very arid, very dry place. But at En-Gedi, we saw a picture of the waterfall, if you recall. And so this is a place that we can sort of think about it like an oasis out in the middle of the desert. And it turns out that as chapter 24 began, Saul has defeated the Philistines who had launched an attack at the end of chapter 23. And now Saul hears again that David is still within the wilderness of En-Gedi. And again, he sends his men out to find and to try to capture David. And as we talked about, something that's very important to remember as we are looking at this text is how Saul has portrayed David to the people of Israel. And we saw that back in chapter 22, that Saul has basically accused David and anyone that helps David of being essentially a traitor to Israel, that they have conspired against the king. Saul has also portrayed David as a man that is seeking any and every opportunity he can to take Saul's life. And really, that's in Saul's mind, that's what David's purpose in life is at this point, to try to find a way to kill Saul. And as we see in these 3 chapters, David's going to disprove all of these notions that Saul has sent forth, and why it's important for us to study this text. So we begin in verse 6. We're sort of right in the middle of where David is thinking about what he's going to do. We know that back in verse 5 he had cut off Saul's robe, but then verse 5 we see that David felt remorse about that because he did have evil intent in verse 4. So now as we pick up in verse 6, David is having a discussion with his men. So verse 6, and he said unto his men, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing unto my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch forth mine hand against him, seeing he is the anointed of the Lord. So David's reasoning here of why he should not kill Saul, simply put, is that this is the Lord's anointed. Now the word anointed simply means consecrated or specifically chosen. The word Christ and the Hebrew equivalent Messiah, right? That tied into the idea of the anointed one. And certainly those are titles referenced to Jesus and not Saul. But again, the idea of anointed is that this is a person that God has specifically chosen or specifically selected for an important task. And so what David's saying here is that I don't have the right to depose of the man that God put in charge. If Saul is again the Lord's anointed, as he says in verse 6, God's the one who put him in that position, and therefore it's not my right to take him out of that position, is what David is telling his men. It's not my right to stretch forth mine hand to kill him and to remove him from a position that I did not put him in. I don't have that right, is what David is saying. Now, of course, we keep in mind that David has been anointed, right? Back in chapter 16, we know David was anointed to be the next king of Israel, but that was looking toward a future moment when he would become king. He's not king right now. If you recall, back in Hannah's song that she sang back in chapter 2, verse 10, the end of that song concluded with the fact that God will protect his king, or God will protect the anointed, and David had respect for that. Later on in 2 Samuel chapter 1, after Saul has died, an Amalekite comes to David, and he's rejoicing about the news of Saul's death. And what does David do to that Amalekite? He puts him to death, right? And the reasoning for that was, why did the Amalekite feel he had the right to attack the Lord's anointed? And so David had an understanding that if God selected him for that position, then God had the responsibility of taking him out. Wasn't David's right to do that. Now you also note here in verse 6 how David refers to Saul. And these small details, it may not seem like a lot to notice, but it is very important because David has been branded as a traitor. He's a rebel against Saul. But verse 6, he calls Saul, or how does he refer to Saul in verse 6? Yeah, unto my master, right? If you're somebody who has disrespect for Saul, like what Saul claims about David, he's not going to refer to Saul as his master. He's not going to use a term of submission or humility to regard his state in light of Saul. And really, this is a good example to talk about how we as Christians need to deal with rulers and authorities that maybe are not favorable to us, about, how do we handle situations in which we have leaders over us that are not favorable to us. David shows a pretty good example. You have to have respect for the office. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 through 2, Paul would tell Timothy about the very same thing. And, in that day, you had Jewish authorities that were persecuting Christians. Later on, you have the Roman authorities that would wind up doing the same thing to Christians. But in 1 Timothy chapter 2, Paul's words to Timothy regarding those who are in authority, he just simply says, I exhort therefore that first of all supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for all men, for kings and for all that are in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and honesty. So, whereas some in Timothy's day, and you certainly see this in the New Testament with some of these Jewish sects, these different Jewish groups, whose idea is that, we have to overthrow the Roman Empire. Paul's advice to Timothy is pray for those that are in leadership, right? And understand that God has appointed them to those places. Same thing that David's doing here. It's something for us to think about as well, right? We need to focus a lot of our time, hopefully, praying for people that are in positions of leadership. And certainly we should be doing that in our prayers. But that's what David's pointing out here, right? God's put him in that position. We need to have respect for him. Now note verse 7. So David stayed his servants with these words and suffered them not to rise against Saul. If you've got another translation there, what do you have for the word stayed? So David did what to his servants? Restrained, right? The word there, the Hebrew word for stayed or restrained, it literally means to split or to tear. And so the idea is, I'll mention this, when you think about in the book of Leviticus where you talk about, animals that have cloven feet, right, where the hoof is divided. That's actually the same word that's being used here. It's the same root of the word that's used here for the word stayed or restrained. So the picture here is that when David says this, there's a sharp contention, or there is a tear in agreement between David and his men. David has said he's not going to take Saul's life, but what happens here is that the servants do not agree with what David has said. They're upset that David will not act on this opportunity. Thus, David has to stay, or David has to restrain his servants with those words so that they will not rise up to attack Saul. He has to settle them down, so to speak. And that's the picture here. David's men, at the end of the day, will not rise up and kill Saul. If they had, David could partially be responsible for Saul's death in that situation. They're his men. David's in a position of authority over them. And if he allows them to go and kill Saul, David would hold some responsibility. But what you see here is, again, that David is a man that's, at least in this moment, he's not going to give in to peer pressure to do something wrong, right? It shows David's a man who can lead and lead righteously even when there are others around him that don't want him to do the right thing. And that sort of just shows that David's a very great leader, right? And it shows that he's a very righteous man. And we'll see that going forward because more as we go forward into these next few verses. So that by the end of verse 7, Saul escapes, but he doesn't have any, at this point, he doesn't have any knowledge of what has just happened or how close he has come to death. So now, verse 8, David, and we're going to go down to verse 15 when David stops speaking tonight, but David decides to talk to Saul about the matter. Verse 8, David also arose afterward and went out of the cave and cried after Saul, saying, My lord the king. And when Saul looked behind him, David stooped with his face to the earth and bowed himself. And what David's actually going to do here is he's going to take an act of vengeance and turn it into an act of mercy. Because we know that back in verse 4, he cut off part of the king's robe. He had evil intent with what he was doing, right? He meant to do harm to Saul. We're going to see that he actually takes that same act and turns it around and uses it to show his mercy towards Saul, because, as we'll see, he had the opportunity to kill him, but because of his mercy, he's not going to do that. And so we're going to see again that David is an innocent man, despite the charges that Saul has made against him. Again, you note how David refers to Saul, right? My lord the king. Verse 8, what he does, right? He stooped down with his face to the earth and bowed himself. Again, if David didn't have respect for the office, he wouldn't have said that. He would have called out after Saul by his first name, right? Generally, we give titles to people that are in position, right, of importance. You think about this, and you think about how David had addressed Goliath to Saul back in 1 Samuel 17. If you remember when David was talking to Saul about Goliath, he doesn't say, my lord Goliath. He doesn't bow down he doesn't go up to Goliath and bow down to him. He told Saul that Goliath was an uncircumcised Philistine, which was basically a taunt at Goliath. David didn't have any respect for Goliath because he's a man that didn't fear God. Later on when he's talking about the lion and the bear and the animals that he killed to protect the sheep, he puts Goliath in the same category as those animals because David did not have a lot of respect for Goliath. And David and Saul had heard David use those words to describe Goliath before, but if you note here, David treats Saul like he is the king. He doesn't do anything derogatory to him. He treats him with respect. So David bows down. He addresses him properly. He bows down his face to the earth and again bows himself down. That's something that's typically done by a person that is or has respect for the man that's in front of him. So verse 9, David begins to speak. He really asks Saul a question. David said to Saul, Wherefore hearest thou men's words, saying, Behold, David seeketh thy hurt? Basically, verse 9, Saul, where have you heard that I'm trying to take your life? Where is that information coming from? Is what David proposes here in this question. Again, why have you listened to the words of men? And you think about how important that is because David is here talking to Saul because he refused to listen to the words of his men in the verses prior because they wanted him to die. But yet, so David showed mercy because he did not act on the words of men. But now David points out, right, Saul's not showing David any mercy because Saul is acting on the words of men. Why have you listened to the words of men? And this is a good point to show out that the words of men a lot of times don't line up with the purposes of God. And David understood that in this context. You think about this question too. We know, of course, that the main motivation for Saul's anger towards David was Saul's own jealousy, right? It's not like there's always somebody that's constantly whispering in Saul's ear that David is an enemy, right? A lot of Saul's anger at David is, self-inflicted. It's his own jealousy. It's not somebody that's talking to him. And so, perhaps what David's doing here is sort of, lightening the charge against Saul in some ways. So that by verse 10, again, David points out the mercy that is extended to him. Verse 10, Behold, this day thine eyes have seen how that the Lord had delivered thee today into mine hand in the cave, and some bade me kill thee. But mine eyes spared thee, and I said, I will not put forth mine hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. Now note that mercy has been extended. I think we can break this down into two ways. Mercy has been extended to Saul in two different ways. First of all, that David says that the circumstances today have not been in your favor, right? And that's the first part of that verse. You now see how that the Lord had delivered thee today into mine hand in the cave. And, the idea there is that what David is pointing out is that the opportunity to take your life, it was right there for the taking. The perfect moment had arrived in some way. And David had the advantage had the opportunity to take advantage of that. Now, it is interesting that David says that the Lord had delivered thee today into mine hand. If we recall back in chapter 23, verse 8, when Saul had first learned about David escaping to the wilderness, let's see, I'm looking for that verse. Chapter 23. Yeah, okay, I had that written down wrong. Yeah, all right, so chapter 23, verse 7, right? Saul told his men that God had delivered David into his hand. But again, we go down to verse 14. David abode in the wilderness, and by the end of the verse it says that Saul sought David every day, but God delivered him not into his hand. And so now, 1 Samuel 24, verse 10, David specifically says, right, the Lord has delivered you into mine hand. And that's, again, that's something important to figure out, right? It shows that God is on the side of David. Again, the phrase, some bade me kill thee. David, very upfront with Saul, right? There's some men in my company that want you dead. They wanted me to take your life, and yet here you are still standing. And as he says in verse 10, it's because of David's pity for Saul that the reason why he does not kill him. But mine eye spared thee, and I said, I will not put forth mine hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. David again has shown pity, and that has allowed Saul to live. In the Old Testament, you often read about man, and especially the Israelites, especially in the books of the prophets, the Israelites continuing to live because God took pity on them. I want you to look in your Bibles, first of all, at Ezekiel chapter 7, verse 4. Again, the idea that David presents in verse 10 of 1 Samuel 24, mine eyes spared thee, it connects to the idea of pity. And Ezekiel chapter 7, verse 4, I think this is the case where, God's talking about judgment here coming upon the Israelites. And you note how he defines it here. Mine eyes shall not spare thee, neither will I have pity, but I will recompense thy ways upon thee, and thine abominations shall be in the midst of thee, and ye shall know that I am the Lord. And so, God's talking about, the defeat of the Israelite nation, and what he says is, it happens because I don't have pity on you anymore. And Isaiah, on the other hand, shows us something a little bit different. Isaiah chapter 63, verse 9, again, talking about the favor of the Lord. This is a little bit different setting, but this is what he says, or what Isaiah records. In all their affliction he was afflicted, and the angel of his presence saved them. In his love and in his pity, he redeemed them, and he bare them and carried them all the days of old. So in that passage, Isaiah is talking about a time in the past where God had protected the Israelites because he had pity on them. And that's what David's saying here in chapter 24, verse 10, right? Saul, you're alive because I decided to have pity on you. I decided to extend to you mercy. And so, naturally, David would wonder, why is it fair that you are out to take my life? Look at the evidence. Verse 11, right? You can almost picture as David has said this, David saying, look, here's the evidence, right? Moreover, my father, see the skirt of thy robe in my hand, for in that I cut off the skirt of thy robe, and killed thee not. Neither know thou and see that there is neither evil nor transgression in mine hand, and I have not sinned against thee, yet thou huntest my soul to take it. David again says, look at the evidence. The word there for fathers, it can show again the relationship that Saul is David's father-in-law. The word father there in that context could also be the way in which a soldier would address his king. In 2 Kings chapter 5, verse 13, the servant of Naaman addressed Naaman as father. It was a term of respect. Right? So look at how I'm addressing you. Look at the fact that I hold the skirt of your robe in mine hand. David holds it up. Saul would have understood what that meant, the cutting of the robe, just as David understood what it meant back in verse 5. And yet David uses that again to show his mercy. He had the opportunity to take his life, he didn't. And Saul, here's the evidence. I was the one who cut off part of your robe, but I didn't kill you. So now you know that despite what you've said about me laying in wait to find any and every opportunity I could to kill you, I've had the perfect opportunity, and yet here you are, you're still alive. Right? I've got the part of your robe in my hand, and yet you're still alive. Now you know that I'm not trying to seek you harm. Right? Know and see that there was neither evil nor transgression in mine hand, and I have not sinned against thee. I've done nothing wrong, yet you have hunted my soul to take it. The word for hunt there means to lie in wait. In Exodus chapter 21, verse 13, that word is used to connect to the idea of premeditated murder. And we know what premeditated murder is, right? That's planned out, that is done by design, and that's what David says to Saul, yet thou huntest my soul to take it. You've planned this out. You have planned to do me evil, despite the fact of what I have done, the goodness and mercy that I have shown to you. And so David has shown Saul the evidence, and verse 12 through verse 15 to me is one of the brightest moments that's recorded about David. And this is something that we don't often remember, but what David does here is absolutely remarkable. So let's read verse 12. The Lord judge between me and thee, and the Lord avenge me of thee, but mine hand shall not be upon thee. Now we need to go back in our Bibles to Deuteronomy chapter 19. We read this a few Wednesdays ago when we were talking about, I think, the beginning of this section. But in Deuteronomy chapter 19, we're talking about the case where someone has bore false witness against another, or has lied about another, and what happens in that situation. Again, verse 16, Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 16. If a false witness rise up against any man to testify against him that which is wrong, then both the men between whom the controversy is shall stand before the Lord, before the priest and the judges, which shall be in those days. And the judges shall make diligent inquisition, and behold, if the witness be a false witness, and hath testified falsely against his brother, Then shall you do unto him as he thought to have done unto his brother, so shalt thou put the evil away from among you. Now you note the process there that was supposed to be implemented when someone was accused of bearing false witness, right? Both men had to appear essentially in court to settle the issue. And as we understand here, not only are they assembled before the priests and the judges, they're also assembled before God in the matter because God has put them in that position to settle the matter. And so the point being here is that the man that has done wrong did not have the right to take revenge in his own hands. He did not have the right, even though he knew this man was lying, he did not have the right to inflict harm on him because that matter had to be settled in court. Now look here at what David has done here. Because that whole point about cutting off his robe, that could have been David taking advantage of this situation and David taking this matter into his own hand. But note what he says in verse 12. The Lord judge between me and thee. So in that particular scenario that we talked about, that court case, David is actually doing what he should have been doing. It was not within David's power to take Saul's life. It had to be settled. This case had to be mediated by somebody else. And that's what David says, right? Instead of taking matters into my own hands, I'm going to go by what the law says. I'm going to let God settle the matter. And this is absolutely, not only is that remarkable, but think about the specific context here. We know that the priests and judges would be involved in a situation like that. Whose side do you think the priest would be on in a situation between Saul and David? What happened in the city of Nob? He wiped the priest out. Well, think about it, right? Saul wiped out the priesthood, right? He wiped out, we talked about, he wiped out Abiathar's entire family. You've got an issue between Saul and David. Who do you think Abiathar is going to side with? Is he going to side with the man who murdered his own family, or is he going to side with David, who's protected him up to this point? Yeah, he would side with David, right? At this point, there's no reason for the priesthood to trust in Saul. Saul has killed off Abiathar's family. And those that are loyal to the priests that, as we saw in earlier chapters, where David has taken them under his wing. You remember we talked about how David was the protector of Israel's religion as Saul was trying to kill the priesthood. The priesthood would have sided with David because he was their ally, and yet you notice here that he doesn't let this matter be handled by the priest. David understood that Saul would not have had a fair trial because the priest would not be an impartial judge or an impartial part of the jury, we might could say, because of what Saul has done here. And so instead of suggesting the idea of letting the priest and the judge decide this, when David knew very well that the priest would automatically side with him, he says, let's just let God handle the matter. Right? Because God, as we know in the book of Acts, God is someone who is not partial to man. Right? He is an impartial God. He is a God of justice. He is a God of fairness. The priest very well may not have been fair to Saul because of what he has done in the past, but David suggests here, let's let God handle the matter. The Lord judge between me and thee, and the Lord avenge me. The idea being here is if the Lord sides on, if the Lord finds me to be the innocent party, the Lord will enact his vengeance the way that he sees fit. But the end of verse 12, mine hand shall not be upon thee. David's saying, I will not put my hand against you because it is not my right to do it. It's not what the law requires. And David could have very well taken advantage of the system because he had the priest on his side, but he suggests here, let's let God handle the matter. We haven't gotten to this, I don't believe, in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, but within that context, as we talked about in Acts chapter 17, there are a lot of Christians there in Thessalonica who were done wrong by the Jews. And we saw that, how Paul was driven out by force. And subsequently, you had a lot of persecution within the city. But if you look in your Bibles, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, it's remarkable what Paul says about the matter about dealing with persecution and those authorities who didn't like Christians in the city. As I'm getting there in my Bible, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 6. That no man go beyond and defraud his brother in any matter, because that the Lord is the avenger of all such. And as we also have forewarned you and testified. Paul said something similar in Romans chapter 12. Again, recompense to no man evil for evil. Because God is the one who will settle the score. And that's what David is doing here. We've mentioned this before, but we as Christians need to have that same mindset. We're not always going to be treated fairly, but we can take confidence in the fact that God, at the end of the day, will make sure that justice is administered, whether it's in this life or whether that is in the next. And that's something that we'll talk about more as we go through the book of 1 Thessalonians. David follows that up, verse 13. As saith the Proverbs of the ancients, wickedness proceedeth from the wicked, but mine hand shall not be upon thee. Well, I'll just ask you, what does David mean by this proverb here? Wickedness proceedeth from the wicked.
Well, you reap what you sow.
Yeah, you reap what you sow. I think Jesus put it another way, right? You shall know a tree by its fruit, right? You remember when Jesus told his disciples that, right? If you want to know what type of tree a person is, you look at the fruit that they bear. That's what David says here. Wickedness proceedeth from the wicked, but mine hand shall not be upon thee. David's pointing out his own innocence here, right? If I'm a wicked individual, wickedness would have proceeded from thee. You would be dead. And this is an indictment. This is referring back to Saul, right? You can tell the type of man that a person is based on the fruit, based on the works that he does. And if Saul's the one who's pursuing after David, who is innocent, shows that Saul is a wicked man because he allows wickedness to proceed forth. Now, verse 14, it is, again, David continues this line of thought about, it doesn't make sense, Saul, why you're pursuing after me. Verse 14, after whom is the king of Israel come out? After whom dost thou pursue? After a dead dog or after a flea? Now, both of those, when you say an animal and an insect, both of them are not going to be very well highly thought of, right? We know that the term dog was a term of derision. Certainly dead dog would be worse than that. What David's just doing here is he's sort of humiliating himself, right? David's saying my worth here is not anything greater than having to worry about a dead dog or after a flea. You think about how silly it would be for the president, for instance, to be concerned with a dog in Utah or a flea or another insect in Ohio, for instance, right? One specific small thing, right? The president doesn't have time to devote his attention to that. Same way with the same thing that David's pointing out here about Saul. Right, I pose no threat to you. I pose just as great of a threat to you as I do as a dead dog would or a flea would. I think Brother Wayne mentioned that a few weeks ago. Think about how many resources Saul is wasting trying to pursue after David. Doesn't make sense, and that's what David's saying, verse 14. So verse 15, the Lord therefore be judge and judge between me and thee, and see and plead my cause, and deliver me out of thine hand. David says here in the matter, I'm not going to take your life. I'm going to let God work in his own time. That's what he had to remind his men of back in verse 6. That's what he reminds Saul of here. And as we're going to see next week, Saul's going to show a pretty emotional response to what David has said. But when we think about the bright moments of David, we think about the story of David and Goliath. We maybe think about his military victories, but this is a very bright moment at least that's recorded about David because of how much respect he had for the law of Moses and how fairly he tried to treat Saul despite Saul's injustice towards him. It's a very remarkable series of events here about how David handles this matter by allowing basically the system, the law of Moses to work and allowing God to handle the matter rather than to take matters into his own hands, which would lead him to sin. We're going to go ahead and stop there tonight. Are there any comments that you'd like to add on to what we've talked about?
I think of that proverb that says, a soft answer turns away wrath. You know, if David had come out yelling and calling Saul names and threatening, and that would just certainly would not have diffused any situation, would have put fuel on the fire, as we say, but he just humbled himself and, just said, I'm just going to let God handle this, and it's a wonderful, like you say, a wonderful trait for David.
Yeah, and as we'll see next week, Saul seems like Saul's a changed man based on the way he responds to what David has said. Any other thoughts or any other comments before we close tonight?
It's also interesting that David has this respect for the king in charge, but years down the line, a lot of those fellows aren't going to have that respect because they just kill one another. One king kills or one man kills another, becomes king, then they turn the tables on him. There's very little respect for the person in office.
Yeah, absolutely. David was certainly unique in a lot of ways compared to some of the other kings that ruled over Israel. We'll stop here tonight. We stopped a little bit early, but we'll pick up in chapter 24, verse 16 next week, and we'll get into, I'm not sure how far, but we'll get into chapter 25, at least in part. But again, thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention this evening.